it's time for the performance rankings.
You know, that wasn't an All-Ireland winning performance.
Probably should have won the game based on their second half performance.
Is it a step too far to say it was the performance so far of the World Cup? Maybe not.
OTB AM's performance rankings with Gillette.
I'm scratching my head. That performances was just lacked that intensity.
Yeah, my computer just decided to do a reboot. Just turned it on at
Doing
like
some updates.
7:28, and it
It
was
hasn't
like,
been on since before Christmas, Johnny.
no, because it actually hasn't. Like, so the last person logged in here appears to have been me, but it decided that whatever the intervening time was, like 10 days or something. You know, even the computer needs to, you know, New Year's resolutions and all that. The performance rankings today, though, the first one with Gillette of the season. No better place to start than Munster Rugby. Now, we will be talking to Ronan O'Gara in due course. Just before we get to Munster Rugby, are you worried about Six Nations at this stage in terms of, not that it'll go ahead necessarily, but crowds? Because it has the makings of an amazing Six Nations.
France has gone to 5,000 in stadiums now for the month of January, and Rog can probably fill us in on that. I think they're their last weekend of full crowds. Last weekend. Ireland's obviously 5,000 now up until the 31st of January, and Six Nations gets going on, I think, 5th or 6th of February. So I wouldn't be worried about going ahead. I think they'll move heaven and earth. Although if Omicron gets into one of the camps, you know, you're goosed, you know, like, you know, as we've seen in Premier League, you know, if the Premier League stops, you know, this is serious, and because they'll do everything they can to get their schedule going. You know, that you know, so many of their camps got shut down, so like these bubbles are going to have to be, you know, super bubbles over the next couple of weeks, although it will have hopefully dissipated a bit. Not that I'm an epidemiologist or anything like that, but I think they'll get the tournament going, and it's a very, very, as you say, very, very good tournament. And last year some of the games were magnificent despite the fact that they were in empty stadiums, and it felt awful being in an empty stadium, but once the action kicked in, the players didn't seem to be affected by it, so it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. And 5,000 in the Aviva, if it's done right, I was there for the Bows games last summer. Actually, the atmosphere can be quite good with
5,000 compared to nobody is massive.
It's much better, yeah. But it's still, you'd hope that by the end of January, you know, the crowds will at least be half capacity. But from an Irish point of view and an Irish rugby point of view, I think those full it's not that I think those full stadiums are basically the money that drives the entire organisation from top to bottom across the board. And if they cannot have full stadiums for the 3 home games in the spring, it's going to be very damaging to the RFU coffers again. So it's a bit of a disaster timing wise for them. Like Munster, we're going to talk about, like, they've got Ulster at home this weekend, and then they have they're playing Wasps in 2 weeks' time, in what would be one of their big earners of the year as well. That's gone, you know, down to 5,000, both down to 5,000. That's big earners gone. They lost Leinster on Stevens' day. That was a full house that was sold out. You know, Leinster have Montpellier coming next weekend. That'll be 5,000. That's a big, you know, blow to them financially. Ulster are not affected by it because the rules are different up north. So, I'm concerned, but I wouldn't think the tournament. I think the tournament will go ahead. The show will go on, but it's whether it can go on in the, you know, will teams be missing 20 players because they've had an outbreak in their camp? Will we have full crowds? Will people be able to travel? Like, the great thing about Six Nations, and my dad made friends with a group of Welsh men in the 70s, and they've been going over and back to each other every year. But they haven't done it for the last couple of years, and there's plans for some of them to come over this time. You know, that's now looking a bit suspect because, you know, they all stay in each other's houses and there's all sorts of things going on. So, and Wales are up first, so that's the fun. And like, you usually have a massive amount of Welsh people coming over on the boat and on the planes, and they add so much to it. So it would be diluted a little bit if that was affected in that way.
We'll talk Munster with Ronan O'Gara later on. The Munster just seem to be in a small bit of a malaise at the minute. Not a good Christmas.
Well, like, if you look at their numbers, they've had a decent season. They've only lost 2 games, so it's not like it's a crisis. But they've lost their 2 most important coaches have decided they're leaving, having said they were going to stay, and they were just really abject against Connacht, and they've put themselves in a really bad spot. And it's only a couple of weeks ago that they came back from that South Africa thing, and that, like, most of their squad, 34 players in isolation, none of their coaches there, and they put together a team kind of experienced players and young kids who no one had ever heard of, went to Coventry and beat Wasps, and there was just a real sense of momentum behind them. And they were really, like, there was a real buzz over there. Their crowd went, you know, a lot of people travelled. There was a really good atmosphere. Peter O'Mahony was buzzing. They played really well. They played really ambitious stuff. And then they came home and they brought some of their frontliners back, and they were terrible against Cast in victory. And they went down to Galway last weekend on New Year's Day. And, like, there's loads of excuses for it, and they're valid excuses because it's been 9 weeks since a lot of them played, and they were, you know, some of them had COVID and all that sort of stuff. but they were abject. They were really, they only lost by 2 points as well, but they were really, really poor, and they played with very little ambition, and they kind of spent 5 minutes on the Connacht line, and they can have their gripes about referees and stuff like that, but they conceded 17 penalties. They made loads of mistakes, and they're like, they should be better than this. They have on paper, they should be Connacht, and they should at least attack games with more ambition, and that's where I would, I think there's a kind of a line out there now that, they should just drive Van Grant to the airport and get rid of him now and just bring in Ian Costello, who managed that game against Wasps, and move on. And you can't do that in rugby. You got to kind of stick with it. Although I wonder, are they, you just wonder about why they were giving Van Grant a 2-year extension in the first place when they play with such little ambition, and why they were so happy with what they have when it's evidently not great. It's not getting the most out of the players they have. They're the second strongest squad in this competition, and yet they can just play so badly. And when they're one of these teams that when they lose and when they play badly, they're really bad to watch as well, and it just feeds into a kind of a bit of despair. But they got Ulster on Saturday in Thomond. If they win again, they'll be out of this red column. They're not in any. It's not like they're in real danger or anything like that. But they're just they're like bad to watch when they're bad. You know what I mean? Like they really stink out the joint when they're not on it.
What'll the atmosphere be like in Thomond against Ulster?
But like 5,000 in Thomond, it's not like Thomond sells out every week in, week out anyway. But 5,000 would be a very small crowd, and it's one of those venues. I think when we came out of COVID and we were doing social distancing, they spread numbers around the stadiums very well, and it actually really worked. You wouldn't think it would work, but it kind of meant there was noise everywhere. Depends on whether they put them all in one stand. That kind of, I think, loses the atmosphere. So it's hard to know. It's really hard to know how it'll be. It'll be better than an empty Thomond, and if they're behind the team, there's no better place to watch a rugby match. And if the team play with ambition and give them something to get behind, then they'll O'Mahony will be back, Tyke Byrne will be back, some of their best players will be back, but Ulster will be strong as well. That's going to be a really good game this weekend. Hopefully it goes ahead. Ulster have had their COVID issues, but I did their press conference yesterday, and they don't know who they have yet, but they hope to have enough players to be able to field the team. So they should be coming down with a decent side.
Yeah.
But this is another thing. Like, how have they been affected by having 2 weeks down, whereas Munster had their problems in November, early December.
How big is the next managerial appointment there, like, for Munster?
It's massive. Yeah, it sets the entire tone and direction of the club and the structure of the whole thing as well, because like Ronan O'Gara, who we're talking to later, he's the director of rugby at La Rochelle. He does the signings, the contracts, and then he has a team of coaches in place who kind of put together the nuts and bolts. Whereas Munster are trying to have a guy who does everything in Van Gran, and he wasn't really qualified for that job. He's a very good coach by all accounts, but he'd never been that kind of all-seeing kind of old-fashioned manager figure. Leinster have split that job in 3. So I think Munster might look at trying to bring in someone above a coach, then have a dedicated coaching team. But like O'Gara would have been the one that everyone wanted to get the job. He ruled himself out fairly quickly. So David Nucifora, the RFU performance director, will have a key role in this. But he's in Australia on his holidays at the moment. He takes kind of a month out every season in the middle of it all. Somehow he's able to do this. Goes home to Australia, and no doubt he's checking his messages, but he's not really driving this at the forefront. So we don't know where it's going to go. They do have Graham Rowntree in there, who's a very good coach. There's a couple of Mike Prendergast at Racing is someone I think they'll look at. He's a very good coach. Noel McNamara, who's from Munster, coached at Leinster, is now with the Sharks in South Africa. He's a name that keeps cropping up as well. There's been a lot of talk about kind of getting a big name in. Maybe Declan Kidney comes back as a kind of that director of rugby. I don't know. I mean, we're still at the point where I'm kind of just throwing out names, but it'll be very interesting. It's massive. Like the head coach is so influential in rugby and sets such a tone. So I think that I'd love to see them go away from the South African model, lean in towards New Zealand maybe, and a kind of more freer side of play, because they've got really good athletes and really good ball players, and right now all they're doing is chasing box kicks half the time.
Worst team to watch of the 4 provinces.
When they're off it, yeah. I mean, when they're on it, when they get it right, they're great. They've great players, they've great energy, they have the skills to unlock teams, and like there's nothing wrong with a conservative game plan when it's fully executed. It's when they're off, they just get bogged down, and they don't have. Ultimately, what's their problem is they play a game that's dependent on bullying teams up front, but they don't have the pack to do that, so they need to find another way. They're kind of they're able to beat 90% of the teams they playing the way they play, but then they get against Leinster or they come up against the big French team or English teams at the elite end of Europe, and even when they perform, they just can't quite get over the line because they're relying on something that they can't really do. So there are, and like the big thing, I mean, we'll get to it. Ronan, like he's talked about that in his column, recruitment and all that sort of stuff that he already done. Who's doing the recruitment down there now? Like who's identifying which players are kept on, which players are let go? who's coming in for next season. Deolande and Snyman, the two big South African signings, and Jason Jenkins, who's another Springbok, all out of contract at the end of the season. Are they going to go with Van Graan to Bath? Like, is he doing recruitment for them?
The whole isn't great at the moment, like in the sense of
thing.
yeah.
Like, they'll say they're all pulling in the same direction. You know, if you're a fringe player down there and Van Graan's telling you what to do, you're looking at him going, well, you're not going to be here next season, so I don't have to listen to you. If you're out of contract, you're wondering, is this guy giving me? There's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving parts at play, and that's where I think it risks coming apart a little bit, which is a real shame because they have the squad to do something this season, and they have they had such momentum going into December, and they've just squandered it somehow with the coaching announcement, with games being called off through no fault of their own. Like the Leinster game was because of an outbreak in Leinster's camp, and then to turn up in Galway and play really, really badly with all the mitigating factors, it's just disappointing. But like, again, it's not terminal. They beat Ulster this weekend. They qualify. They could be one of the top seeds coming out of the European pools. They'll suddenly be a feel-good factor in a couple of weeks' time. Just right now, after that game, and with everything that's gone on with the coaching stuff, it just feels like they're just squandering a real chance right now, but it's far from terminal. Yeah,
so the Gillette performance rankings, Munster are in the red this morning. That was probably a short head enough in terms of Mount Bellew Moylaw. Mount Bellew Moylaw obviously lost to Pearses, it was a few weeks ago now, in very controversial circumstances. Within the game and obviously without the game, because afterwards the referee had to deal with kind of, I guess, some physical altercations really involving the Mount Bellew Moylaw players. But the referee's report has come out, and I quote, "After I blew my whistle to signal the end of the game, I was knocked forward due to being pushed strongly in my back. One of my umpires, Brendan Healy, told me after the game there was on Cregan Muilocha player wearing the number 15 jersey, Barry McHugh, who had pushed me with force from behind. I was then verbally abused and subjected to threatening conduct by a number of players, and so on and so forth." So obviously this would be a club local to me. I know feelings down home, about the refereeing of the game were very, very strong. It was a 1-point game. Mount Bellew Moylaw had performed heroics after a lot of near misses to win a Galway title at the behest of Corofin, and obviously fancied their chance then of going on and win Connacht. This didn't come to pass, and there were probably grievances about the performance of the referee, but a lot of strong bands are going to come out of this, out of what happened in the immediate aftermath of the game, and I don't think these lads have any excuses. I think it's very, very hard for referees to come into sport in general at the moment, particularly Gaelic games, and these were not nice scenes.
No, I have to say it passed me by at the time. I just picked up on it yesterday when Tommy was kind of running me through what was going on in the show, and it was pretty shocking stuff. I mean, anyone who played sport with me would be rolling their eyes hearing me moralising about players losing their rag with referees. I wasn't the greatest in that regard, but certainly if the referee's report is on the money, like you can't lose the head in that way and say the things that they said or they allegedly said to the referee and not expect some sort of repercussions. It speaks to a culture really in the GAA where the referee, and again, it's like a rugby person moralising about respecting referees. I mean, it's one of the great
that's
myths
fair,
of rugby.
Yeah, but
it's overblown, but it doesn't.
It's
certainly, you
though.
don't get abused to this level.
Well, you're not going to get pushed.
You're not going to get pushed. You're not going to get effed and blinded out of it.
7 players are up for suspensions here. 7 players.
Yeah, it's remarkable. They just obviously collectively lost the head as a team, and I'm sure it's really embarrassing. Like
I've sympathy for the players in the sense that they should have regrets. And in the old days, this was in the referee's report. It was in the match report. It's now on TV, and it's now everyone can see it. But you have to put yourself in the referee's shoes here. The referee left that stadium feeling utterly intimidated, and if there were 30 players in the pitch that started the game, how many of them had 5 out of 10 performances? Maybe the ref had a 5 out of 10 performance, and it's completely magnified. And you have to think of the mental health difficulties of a referee, not to mind the physical altercation and feeling afraid, because he's not surrounded by bodyguards or anything like that after the game. He's surrounded by Mount Bellew Moylaw players who obviously did lose the rag. But I think we really need to start thinking about future referees here, and why don't any of your mates want to become referees? Partly one of the reasons they don't want to be in a situation like that, and where they're vilified from the stands, and then after the game, excuses will be made for the players when the referee might have had a shocker of a game, but he didn't mean to do that. He might have had a bad game. He needs a lot more protection than this.
It's also an impact of the GAA effectively shutting down the inter-county season for half of the year and shining a light onto the different corners of their game, which I think it's great for the club players, and I know it's a big debate all the time about club players, and the whole thing is rooted in the club player. But if you are showing semi-finals of county games in on national television, which wouldn't even have got national newspaper coverage 20 years ago unless there was a row, and the row would be reported by a freelancer who was there. Suddenly you're beaming the kind of dirty little kind of corners of the game into and players have to have a responsibility. Like you're these lads, if they'd done this when it wasn't on TV, or it wasn't, if there was inter-county on this week, or on the week it happened, it would be buried everywhere, and they move on. Whereas they're now being in the public eye, being being discussed on, national radio, in national papers, all that sort of stuff, and it's a huge responsibility for amateur players who are really just representing their parish in big games, and they should they obviously have to have self-respect and respect for the person that's volunteered. I know they probably get, I don't know if they get a few bob in the GAA, but referees usually get some small.
They get a nominal amount.
Yeah, nominal,
but it's interesting.
But effectively a volunteer, to do that, and it just shines such a bad light on their team. Like their whole town has been this, or is it a village? I don't know. It's been kind of.
Yeah, it's a couple of towns, obviously Montbellion, my lot, but when I was playing back in the day, the referees, a lot of them were interesting characters, and a lot of them you'd find them quite difficult to deal with at times when they'd make mistakes, and that's what kind of annoyed me. But a lot of the reason why characters end up being referees, because a lot of other people will just not do it, so you'll end up with this broad spectrum of individuals who become referees. But it's not a challenging proposition at the minute for a young person to become a referee, and I think Val Daly, the Montbellion my lot manager, needs to come out, and as much as he needs to defend his players, we need to put out there that this is not acceptable. Even if the referee had a 0 out of 10 performance, he didn't do that deliberately trying to lose the game for Montbellion my law, and I know the stakes are really, really high. I know they thought they might have had a chance getting to Croke Park, but think of that referee going to bed that night, and you can be sure he didn't come out of the ground with 20 people going up to him saying, God, I'm really sorry for what happened to you there. He would have been left alone, and people would have cursed him going home in their cars. And you have to think of him in this situation, because even if he did have a bad game, and I'm not saying he did, I didn't watch the game, it's not fair, and it needs to be set out in very clear tones that this is not acceptable, because there are massive mental health ramifications for a referee in this situation, I think.
Yeah, there are. I mean, there are some referees who love it. There are, maybe don't love it to that extent, but
the notoriety,
a little bit. Yeah, I think that it attracts it. It's. I mean, why
they don't love being surrounded by 7 or 8 players?
The physically intimidating stuff is not it's just not on. I mean, it's clearly not on. It almost goes without saying that it's not on. And we've seen it at the elite level of rugby during the summer with the Lions tour, and Rassie Erasmus, filming an hour-long video criticising the referee, and the referee Nick Berry subsequently come out and said how difficult it's been, basically shaking his confidence as a ref. He's fallen down a level since that happened. So, in a sport that's supposed to be about respect of rugby and all that nonsense that we hear from that, the official side of the game. But certainly this is another extreme of that. When the tone is set, and it's set by inter-county managers, it's set by players.
It's endemic. It's endemic in the game.
It's in football as well.
Games. It is. It's endemic, and in football is. I think footballers should be punished more for the abuse of referees, verbal abuse and stuff like that. I think if the referees know the players and have a chat beforehand, it really, really helps. And I think League of Ireland referees, some of them are very good. They'll have good games, they'll have bad games. But if you put yourself in the referee's shoes for those last 5-10 minutes, he's had to make probably a lot of very, very tough calls. And if you're burdened by that pressure of the intimidation, it's going to skew you as well. So we're all human here. I don't know. I hope this is a watershed in terms of Gaelic games. But we do have other things to get to. LOI to Scotland. This is remember the Donegal potato pickers back in the day when there was no work in Ireland? They go over to Scotland for the summer, get their work. A lot of them stayed over there. Strong links between Scotland and Ulster and all that. Strong links between the LOI and Scotland now. Kenny Shields, Northern Ireland women's coach, former Derry City manager, who also is coaching the SPL. He's very, very interested views in the Star today, which are well worth reading about the standard difference here, or lack thereof in times. So we have Johnny Kenny, who's strongly linked to the move to Celtic. Dan Cleary has gone as well in the last couple of days. I was actually talking to him yesterday. I was talking to Ross Tierney, who joined Motherwell. Dan Cleary's gone to St Johnstone, Ross Tierney's gone to Motherwell. We'll talk to him tomorrow, hopefully, on the show. Liam Scales has done well for Celtic, and obviously Jane McGrath. Jane McGrath would not be playing for Ireland but for what he's done for St Mirren. I think that's the bottom line why it appeals to players.
And he's shown a path. I think you could throw in, it's slightly beyond the scope a little bit, but James Brown, the Drogheda United right back, going to the Blackburn under-23s when he's a first team player here, I think is from the same. I think it's about the food chain.
Yeah.
It's the football food chain, and it's where Ireland's place is. And if Ireland wants to be taken seriously as a football nation, our league should not be losing players to a country of a similar size like Scotland. But at the moment, Scotland
We don't have a
far-
Celtic or Rangers. We don't have a Celtic or
but
Rangers.
There's one thing losing a player to Celtic like Liam Scales or potentially Johnny Kenny, but losing players to teams like Motherwell and like Jamie McGrath going to St Mirren, wasn't it?
Yeah, but
like that is.
I don't have an issue with it.
I've no issue with it right now, but our ambition should be.
They say
I mean, it's like Scotland has a football industry. They treat their footballers seriously. They've got proper football clubs. Their football clubs are institutions. They're in the community. They attract big crowds, and they're higher up on the football food chain than we are.
Yeah.
You are more likely to get it's a launch pad for your career. So Jamie McGrath does well at Dundalk. He moves to St Mirren, which they haven't been in the Europa League group stages as far as I'm aware, but Dundalk have been. But Dundalk playing the worst ground, one of the worst grounds in Ireland, in a league that features part-time players, that only lasts 42 weeks or whatever, that has people getting not paid in the off season. Like these are all the things that go on in the League of Ireland, and he goes to St Mirren, and now he's going to probably get a move somewhere better as a result. And he's also an established Irish international. And from Ross Tierney's point of view, I saw there was a lovely video released by Motherwell when he went over, and he had his Bows backpack on. Like I'm a group of middle-aged Bows fans, older than myself, who were like half of them were in tears watching.
Are you middle-aged now?
I'm on the younger in this WhatsApp group, but I'm getting there. I'm 40 next year, so 40 this year now.
Keep it up anyway.
Yeah, but like they were in tears, like watching Ross Tierney with his Bows backpack going around Motherwell and meeting all the staff and stuff. But what he said was like, I'm coming from a part-time environment, and he's training 4 times a week with Bows. He's playing in a good league. He played in Europe. He was one of the best players. But for Bows had a season. He played in the Aviva in front of 44,000. But he considers that he's now a footballer because he has gone to a proper.
He's gone to an industry.
A proper league.
So we will get to the papers. This is the Star. Now, we'll get to the papers. Irish Eyes, AYES, and it's Kenny Shields talking about the players. So we have Aaron McAniff, who's interestingly mentioned as well, whose time at Hearts, according to Kenny Shields, actually isn't going that well because of the style of football that's being played by some clubs. But obviously, Scales is kind of the big one. But Ross Tierney, who has a very, very interesting story to tell in terms of his personal life as well. Hopefully we'll get to that tomorrow, but an absolute shining example of what can happen in the League of Ireland. But from the perspective of the player, Rudd, as you say, you can't blame him. You cannot blame him for making that step. He's now going to be playing against Celtic and Rangers.
I know you brought through the fairly facetious comparison to the Donegal and the famine and stuff, but like right now, as far as I'm aware, the offers that are on the table in the League of Ireland are quite good for good players. And these players, like Dan Cleary, pretty much had every team in the league. Now that word at salt, throwing a good deal. Like Bows, who have up until now pretty much exclusively thrown out 1-year deals, have been signing players on more than 2-year deals. They're offering good terms. They're offering long-term security as well, which hasn't been a factor. I know Pats are doing the same. I know Dundalk are doing the same. Rovers are obviously doing it as well. And there's like for this tier of player that's going to Scotland, there are good options to stay at home. But if you're 22, 23, older players than Ross Tierney, like Dan Cleary's much older than that. I think he's about 27, isn't he? But he's
also come back from Britain, so he probably had this sense of mission retrieval as well, where he wanted one last go at the UK, and I respect that. Ross is a little bit different.
Yeah, and like say James Brown going to Blackburn, this might be his best chance to go and at least give it a go and be a Blackburn Rovers player and or be a play for Motherwell, play against Celtic and Rangers, catch the eye and get your move. I've absolutely no objection to the players going and doing it. I completely understand why they do. But
you're totally right. We need to have an industry. Exactly. We shouldn't really be losing players to middle ranking to lower ranking Scottish teams. No. Essentially, I can completely see what
right now. I completely understand why we are. But if we're to aspire to having a serious football, be a serious football country, it shouldn't be happening. We shouldn't be relying on managers in England and Scotland to play our players so that the national team can pick them. There's loads of examples of players like that. Stephen Kenny would love to be picking. Aaron Connolly's obviously making a move this week. Jason Knight might be moving up in the ranks, but then he has to impress Bielsa and get into the Leeds team if he gets there. You've got Kelleher on the bench for Liverpool. There's so many examples, and they're probably possibly not even the best examples of it. Whereas if you have a functioning league here, at least you'll have a group of players who are playing at a good level. But we don't have that right now. We've a league that I love and that you love, but it's not anywhere near what Scotland have.
On the plus side, Kenny Shields' point of view is that the football standard and the technical qualities and the way that teams play here in the league, generally from top to bottom in the Premier Division, is actually at odds with the way the SPL teams function at the lower rung. Now, I don't watch enough of SPL to know this, and again, the pitches are probably not great this time of year. But Kenny Shields' point is that actually the standard of football, in a certain way, is better in the LOI than the bottom of the SPL because teams don't kick it long as much. And I can attest that if you haven't gone to League of Ireland games, you're not a regular, and you're probably from a part of this country that doesn't have a League of Ireland club, because there are large swathes of it that doesn't. You may not know that actually the standard of football and the style of football has improved exponentially thanks to summer football and thanks to coaching and thanks to the commitment of players. Number 2 on the performance rankings, so we're getting good. Gordon Elliott, Green. I'm sure you're watching the racing over the Christmas week.
It was not, Johnny. I'm going to let you take this one because the racing passes me by largely. So I get most of my stuff from reading and listening to you. Brian
O'Connor, I have to find this what he wrote yesterday in the Irish Times, actually. Brian O'Connor had an interesting article yesterday, which was essentially 10 things that racing could do to improve itself / its image in 2020. One of them was... and this is just 2022, sorry. Finally, all of us are effectively lab rats for this information gathering, pain for profit, frontier justice, social media age, voluntarily carrying digital septic tanks in our pockets and wondering why so many are so unhappy, right? So Brian is Brian is a great character. He's quite curmudgeonly at times in the press room, and his articles reflect that. But he's a brilliant writer, the leading racing journalist outside the Racing Post in Ireland right now, and he's spoken about the challenging year the racing had, much of which involved Gordon Elliott back in March, as you remember, photographing a dead horse. Took his punishment, took his 6-month ban, took it on the chin, returned with an absolute vengeance at Christmas, and won the Savills Chase, one of 3 Grade 1s I think he's won over the last few weeks, beating Aplu Tart, who's owned by Cheveley Park, who only abandoned him after the whole mess in March. So Cheveley Park abandoned him. Galvin got up in the line under David Russell, who himself came back at the age of 42 from 11 months off, injured, gets up in the line, unbelievable ride. And then on Sunday, he wins Nace's only Grade 1 of the season with a very exciting Ginto, who's owned by Noel and Valerie Moore. Noel and Valerie Moore made a lot of money, but they're investing it in Gordon Elliott's. Big fan of me, GAA as well, has involved in Bective, his local club. I think he's involved in the ladies team as well. But Gordon Elliott has gone full swing. And I talk about mental health. I've no doubt Gordon Elliott's mental health was in a very, very bad way. I think people were actually worried for him because everything that happened around that time was in the papers. It was all over the news, all over the world. Like leading American sports news kind of bulletins included photos of Gordon Elliott on this horse. He's accepted it. He's worked hard during his suspension. He's come back and he's had an unbelievable Christmas. And I think he's a sign, if you're starting off January in a bad way, things can and will get better. Briefly, we have the best of the best, and this is Man City. The performance rankings for Gillette. 11 wins on the bounce. If you're talking about the Shamrock Rovers, the League of Ireland title, I mean, this has just gone from being interesting to, in almost no time, being gone.
Yeah,
the title is dead.
The title, and I'm sure Man City fans enjoyed yesterday evening seeing Man United losing 1-0 as well.
Yeah.
I probably did. Yeah, I think they did. I think Man City fans have no truck with the fact that their team is that much better than everyone else. I think Souness on the weekend called it they're the best squad in English football history. I
have a big problem with Man City because part of me just loves the way they play and part of me loves the consistency under Guardiola as much as they want to win the Champions League and they can almost like park the league now and just concentrate on that. Part of me just hates the funding of it and just that whole it's just financial fair play and blah blah blah.
I find them very cold. I went to see Man City in the 90s. I was there the day Kinkadze scored that goal against Southampton.
That was the Man City that I remember in Main Road.
They were crap. That was probably the best moment of that entire decade for them, and then they went down into the. But
I bet you the atmosphere was way better back then than it is.
I love going to Main Road. I was a Liverpool fan, and we couldn't get tickets to Liverpool, so we went to Man City. But that's the Man City that I have a kind of a romantic feel for. But I'm sure the fans don't really have. I'm sure most of them are really. Some of them maybe do, but I think most of them are loving the fact that their team is consistently excellent every week and plays the best football in the world. I find it very cold, very corporate. I would have major problems with the way they're funded. I wonder why these English fans who rioted against, no, not rioted, but who went up in arms against the Super League don't seem to have any problem with these oil-rich nations buying up football teams and making them almost unbeatable across a long season. It's just I don't understand why you wouldn't be up in arms about this. And there's another one coming down the tracks. I mean, we're a couple of years away from it, but Newcastle are probably the only ones who can compete with them on a long-term basis. They're the mess now, but they'll eventually get it right.
That's the Saudi derby that's going to become such a feature of our lives. That's it for the performance rankings this week.
OTB AM's performance rankings with Gillette.